All right, hi. We're going to do an exam review. One thing I want to mention about this is that for this upcoming exam, this first exam for the Cognitive Psych course, an online exam that is randomly generated from a larger set of questions. So I want you to not think of this as a study guide. At least in my definition of a study guide is one where I can kind of give you some strong hints about what kinds of questions and what topics you're going to see covered on the exam. But since I have written questions that come from all of the PowerPoints and lectures that I have provided, um, essentially everything that I've covered in those lectures is fair game as a question you might see on the exam. And as I mentioned, it's going to be randomly generated, so everyone will have a slightly different exam. So rather than presenting that kind of review, here what I have done is I have tried to simplify and condense the original notes to provide a high-level overview and summary of the material. Obviously, there is a lot more detail back in the original notes, so of course you still should go back and review those videos, review the PowerPoints, and review all of the good notes that you took from those. I want to also emphasize that the questions do not overlap the questions used on the chapter quizzes. Those come right out of the textbook. So these are a completely different set of questions that I have written based off of everything that I just said, the lectures and the PowerPoint themselves. So let's get started here, starting with the first um, chapter, the set of notes on the background influences on cognitive psychology, including the emergence of the information processing ideas that came from computer science. So, the work of Alan Turing in uh, generating kind of a formal theory of computation, defined here as the Turing machine. And then the idea that if what we might want to do then in this case is um, suggest that if computers are things that engage in computation, then maybe the brain is something like a computer, and we want to apply what we understand about computational theory to the brain. And so here we see the idea of the beginnings of treating the brain as a digital computer that operates on information. The black box testing business is the idea that I think I used the analogy in that section about if you were to take an experimental psychologist from, say, the early 20th century and bring them into the modern era and give them a digital computer and let them see that it can apparently perform some kind of complex computation, could they figure out what that is, right? Without letting them see the code that governs the operation of that machine, could they somehow use the methods of experimental psychology to discover the internal rules that this system follows and what kinds of tests they could try to give such a machine? The idea here is that just like with the human brain, which we cannot read people's minds and we can't read people's thoughts, so that means the human mind is a black box. We can't see into it, right? The same is true of a computer processor, unless, of course, we do have some ability to access the machine code that it's running on. But in that example, in that what we might call a thought experiment, this experimental psychologist who doesn't have any pre-existing knowledge of what a computer is would sort of be kind of reduced to performing some kind of experimental psychology testing to try to figure out what's going on in there. Importantly, though, engaging in behaviorist style testing, such as Skinnerian reinforcement paradigms, would probably not provide a lot of information about the kinds of computational rules that the machine uses. So that would necessitate the idea that we need more complex methods of studying these computational processes. Also, in this topic of treating the mind as a computer, we get different levels of computation processing here coming from David Marr. And so in this case, he creates kind of a hierarchical level going from lower implementation levels of processing to higher, more abstract symbolic levels of processing. But the idea from the upward causation view is that the lower levels are fully deterministic of the upper level stuff. Doesn't leave much room for downward causation. We didn't get into the details of that too terribly much. But it's not a very popular idea in modern cognitive psychology. The idea that somehow higher level thoughts and processes can have an influence on the structure of the nervous system and the neurons themselves. We just had a presenter here at UCF last week, Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who is a neurobiologist at Stanford University, and he is becoming well known for his stance on free will versus determinism, which is he rejects all forms of free will. And he made the claim in the middle of that talk that he didn't really buy the concept of downward causation. So, not that that could be used as an argument for free will necessarily, he just doesn't buy the idea. But that's an aside that we don't need. Let's get into the rest of this introductory chapter here. The history of cognitive psych research began in the 1800s with some of the earliest experimental psychology that we have, like psychophysical research, looking at how people respond to various sensory stimuli. And then the research of Helmholtz, Wundt, and Donders with their reaction time studies, what Wundt had called mental chronometry. We saw Donders' methodology of the simple reaction time versus discrimination time and response selection time as part of that process. We also talked a little bit about phenomenology here, the idea of trying to understand the nature of someone's conscious experience, which is a kind of a precursor to the Gestalt idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So we want to understand the nature of that whole of conscious experience. Of course, then there was behaviorism. But one of the things that we talked about with behaviorism was kind of a strict focus on external causes of behavior that ignored the hidden internal black box stuff that they rejected as being unscientific because you can't observe it in any direct way. But they also adopted these overly simplistic explanations of behavior, again, mentioning, say, Skinnerian reinforcement ideas or even Pavlovian classical conditioning ideas. They're all very simple stimulus and response explanations without any internal cognitive mechanisms like perception, attention, memory, and decision making, and language, and all these things that might be part of cognitive psychology. So, of course, with the computational era emerging here, we get these ideas about information theory. Shannon's information theory gives us the signal-to-noise ratio and channel capacity and the concept of measuring information in terms of bits and quantifying information transfer in terms of bits per second or bandwidth. Then all of these ideas give us an empirical way to study computation and cognition. And then hence we get what we sometimes call the cognitive revolution, a bit of an exaggerated term here. It's not as if cognitive psychologists stormed the psych buildings and kicked out the behaviorists and sent them all packing, but rather it just became relatively quickly very unfashionable to talk like a behaviorist in psychology anymore. All right, into the next part, we get into the neuroscience here. It certainly is the case. Something that I think came up in these early lectures is the issue of neural or biological plausibility, which means that when we have a theory of cognition, sometimes these theories of cognition can be quite abstract theories of computation. But we also want to be able to make an argument that this kind of computational process could occur in brains. And that's what we mean by biological plausibility, that it is plausible to imagine a bunch of neurons being able to do this, whatever this is, right? Whatever this computational theory is. So that means that we want to try to maybe explore exactly how it is that neurons could function as computational systems. So in this section, we talked a little bit about the structure of the brain and central nervous system, that's CNS, and of course, a review of the basics on neurons and synapses. But we also looked here, and this is pretty important, about the idea that a lot of the things that happen in cognition, like learning and memory, involve changes in our knowledge over time, and this would suggest then that that must reflect changes in the brain. over time. And that's where we get into neuroplasticity. We talked about Hebb's law as a way of explaining how neurons can change their synaptic strength as a function of repeated use or disuse. A little bit about different types of neurons, like sensory and motor neurons and interneurons and stuff like that. But from here, we got into the idea of computing with neurons. And this is where we talk about artificial neural networks, or ANNs, the McCulloch and Pitts neuron with these various decision circuits. These were examples of like the AND rule, the OR rule, and the XOR and stuff like that. So review all of that. Then we talked about the idea of, the McCulloch and Pitts idea is a very fixed kind of thing where things have a fixed connection strength. But if we want to change the connection strength, and again, we can invoke Hebb's law to see how that could be plausible, then we get the perceptron, right? The first trainable neural network where the input layer can, as a function of feedback, can change the weight of its inputs to the output or decision layer. It also then is kind of interesting that in the early 60s, Hubel and Wiesel had made these discoveries studying cat visual cortex function of simple cells and complex cells in the visual cortex that respond to lines of a specific orientation. And modern research has shown how these kinds of neurological findings can be built into an artificial neural network that could, potentially explain how vision works from both a computational and biological view. And then last up, we surveyed some scientific methods, stuff like EEG, functional MRI, and things of that nature. So go again to the details of the notes and just make sure you review each one of those and understand the basics of how they work and the kinds of things that we can learn about the brain and its relationship to cognition from that. Keep in mind the idea here is less about what we might call structural imaging, right? We don't care about, we care, but in cognitive neuroscience, we don't care so much about knowing about what the parts of the brain are, but we're more interested in how those different parts of the brain connect to different cognitive functions like perception and attention and so forth. So functional cognitive neuroscience, right? Okay, the next one, a really big, long set of lectures there. I apologize again for how long that turned out to be, but it's typical for me. I'm a perception guy, so I'm going to talk forever about perception. So we had a lot of videos on this topic here. So we talked about what I had defined in that set of notes as 5 problems in perception, right? We need to understand some things about the nature of the external stimuli and how they are detected by the sensory organs and how these sensory organs work, how the different sensory neurons work, how the rods and cones, the photoreceptors in the eye work, and so forth. The idea is that we're converting all of this energy into some sort of a set of sensations, right? So we talked about visual sensations like brightness and color, auditory sensations like pitch and loudness. But then the concern is that if perception begins with these sensations, one of the concerns is that the sensations individually are meaningless. The fact that I'm seeing some patch of blue or green in some part of my visual field, which is a visual sensation, doesn't tell me that I'm looking at a tree or a person wearing a blue shirt or anything along those lines. So we need to find a way to determine the meaning of all of these meaningless sensations. This theory is called sensation-mediated perception because of the idea that sensations mediate the relationship between our perceptual reality in the mind versus the outside reality out there. But the problem is called poverty of stimulus, right? The idea is that the sensations themselves, which are the stimulus for perception, just do not carry that much information, which then means that we have to impose a lot of information internally, a lot of meaning internally to achieve perception. And that's our next major problem here. How does the brain do that? How does the brain decode the pattern and therefore impose meaning onto the meaningless input? We talked about different views of top-down and bottom-up processing here, like Mars edge detection scheme and some of the top-down views. The idea that perception is about a construction, right? And last up, we talked about how perception is used. So here we got into things like Gibson's direct perception theory, which focuses on perception and action and the importance of how perception works for the control of action. And that also relates to the two-channel theory that shows that perception may work in two different fundamental ways, right? The dorsal stream that involves the parietal lobe um, is the where channel that maybe is about perception for action. And the ventral stream that involves the temporal lobe is what we call the what channel, and that's perception for recognition. And what we saw there is that there are differences in recognition tasks versus action tasks, especially in cases of brain damage. Okay, so a little detail here on the bottom-up processing. So, of course, make sure you can define what that means, or the bottom-up construction process. Are artificial neural networks a bottom-up process? Some of the early ones, at least, were thought to be. Certainly, like the McCulloch and Pitts neural circuitry is a bottom-up process. And what that means is that things go kind of, sometimes this is referred to as a feed-forward model. So what you see is you have an input layer, and then you have a hidden layer, and then you have an output layer, and things go in one direction, right? And the input layer is the bottom of the system. That's your photoreceptors and your sensory data, and we're building up from the bottom up, right? And so we could theoretically sometimes describe artificial neural networks as feed-forward, bottom-up processes. But one of the things we saw is that with the perceptron model, the input layer can retrain its weights that converge to the output layer or decision layer. And how does it do this? Well, in part, it's driven by feedback. And the feedback is basically coming the other direction, telling the system your judgment was correct or maybe incorrect. And that's a top-down effect. So here we see that the kind of inclusion of both bottom-up and top-down influences shows up very early on in neural networks here. So that's not really a bottom-up process, long story short. We talked about Mara's theory about early stages of vision, about using the spatial derivative to find edges, luminance, contrast in the visual scene, and that maybe we can build up to some sort of mapping of all of the edges using simple and complex cells, and we get the raw primal sketch. The limitation here is that building a raw primal sketch, just mapping out the edges of the visual scene, does not equate to object recognition, which is, according to this constructivist idea, when I'm looking at an object, here, I'll just pick up this book here next to me, that what I am doing when I'm looking at it is I'm building a three-dimensional model of it in my mind, right? I'm not just seeing a 2D sketch of it, right? So in that case, there's a big difference between the raw primal sketch and the final 3D model. So additional information needs to be brought in to help us get there. This is where Mara's theory doesn't really cover all of the bases. So now we've got to bring in top-down processing. And we talked about, the classical Helmholtzian idea of unconscious inference, that we just unconsciously appeal to past experience to help us interpret the meaning of sensations. We talked about how such processes could sometimes make mistakes, and this could be a straightforward way of explaining why illusions happen. We also talked about Bayesian predictive coding. Here, the idea is that the brain is trying to use a statistical decision rule to make predictions about what's going to happen from moment to moment. As I move around, I should be able to predict certain regular changes in my perceptual reality as I interact with the world. And as long as I'm successfully making predictions, this kind of Bayesian stuff is potentially working. That's also where the free energy minimization principle comes in here, because the idea here is that every time I make a prediction, there may be some error associated with that prediction, and that error kind of increases informational energy or free energy in the brain, which is equated with the idea of surprisal. So if my surprisal levels are high, that means every time I interact with things, weird and unexpected things begin to happen. And obviously that means my perceptual systems are not working. So I need to find a way to change these statistical decision rules that we're using, change my model of the world and so forth. And assuming I can figure out how to do this, then I'm able to make my perceptual system work. Maybe this is what happens in infancy. Maybe one argument is that this could somehow degrade as we, in adulthood as a result of some sort of psychiatric condition, like, say, paranoid schizophrenia. We don't need to go into those topics, but nevertheless, that's kind of the implication, is that maybe what happens in these kinds of psychosis type situations, hallucinatory, delusional situations, is that we see some difficulty dealing with the information entropy occurring within the brain. Okay, other examples of top-down processing, the idea of recognition by template matching, that I have to have stored mental representations of everything that I can recognize, pictures essentially of what it looks like, and that I could perform these kinds of comparisons between the stored representation and the incoming sensory data. And that kind of matching process is how I recognize anything. We talked about how that would work, but we also talked about some of the problems with it, such as if I really have a template for every recognizable thing, that means I have trillions and trillions of images that I have to sort through. And well, that's going to take a long time. We talked about how we could speed this up with the difference between serial and parallel processing, so make sure you're familiar with that. Um, But we thought maybe another way to do this, better way to do this, is to somehow reduce the total number of templates with other kinds of representations, structural descriptions, perhaps, right, that simplify the nature of the representations and therefore reduce the total number. But in this case, now a new problem might emerge, which is that these structural descriptions place certain constraints on the nature of what we are able to recognize, and such constraints or assumptions might not apply to all perceptible objects. Um, so in general, we talked about some of the reasons why we might accept top-down theories. We also then covered a long list of some of these challenges and problems faced by top-down theory. So make sure you're familiar with a lot of this as well. One final example on that topic is aphantasia, because if the idea that perception is about building a mental representation of reality that is now visualized in the mind, how do we reconcile that with people who claim to lack the ability to create visual images and nevertheless are able to perform pretty normally on pretty much all perceptual tests that we can give them? So that would seem to suggest that perception does not depend on the quality of one's mental representations or imagery. Uh, all right, here's that little note on direct perception, as I had suggested before from Gibson. The idea is that the theme of direct perception is a rejection of the sensation-mediated view. So rather than suggesting that perception begins with meaningless sensations, here the idea is that perception begins with meaningful information in the environment. So this is a direct refutation of the poverty of stimulus claim, right? Rather than suggesting that perception begins with an impoverished stimulus, instead we would say it's an enriched stimulus coming to us from the environment. And this would then also suggest that all of these debates about processing of the information, right, going from sensation to perception and whether that's bottom up or top down, that debate itself becomes quite a bit kind of a moot point, right? Because now no kind of processing is needed, right, in this theory. Perception is no longer a construction anymore. This would fit with the aphantasia stuff, by the way. All right, from there we moved into the attentional chapter, so we'll try to get through this one in a reasonable amount of time. We had three core types of attention that we talked about here. Attention, sorry, selective, divided, and sustained attention. Why do I keep saying intention? Attention, right? Signal detection analysis here. So we talked about the idea of hits and misses, false alarms, and correct rejections as part of what we might do in a attention task. We also talked about how we can use eye movements as a way of trying to measure someone's attention, but that only works primarily for what we call overt attention, right? If their eyes are looking at something, then that's an overt measure. And if that's exactly what they are paying attention to, then so far so good. But what we also suggested here is that there is such a thing as covert attention. And that means that even when your eyes are looking at one thing, your mind can be elsewhere. And so eye movements are not going to be very informative about covert attention. And then we studied a variety of different things under the heading of covert attention, such as change blindness and inattentional blindness and the look but fail to see accidents and so forth. I skipped over this business about the top-down factors that influence where we look in various tasks, and the bottom-up influences on eye movements we might call attentional capture, that things that just grab your attention, right? When we think about limitations to human attention, we can invoke capacity theory here, and capacity theory suggests that attentional tasks require some degree of mental effort and cognitive effort. And certain tasks can reveal the differential effects of this here, like the Posner queuing task. Here, what we saw is that there are exogenous cues, and these are the ones that are considered to be more bottom up, that just grab your attention, and those don't really demand a lot of mental effort. And those show high amounts of inhibition of return, suggesting that we quickly dismiss irrelevant exogenous cues. But with the endogenous cues, those are the ones that are more demanding of our attention, require a little bit more interpretation, and influence our top-down attentional processes. And those do not show the same inhibition of return because they're driving more sustained task positive kinds of behaviors. From there, we shifted over into visual search. We talked about Treisman's ideas about stages of processing in these kinds of search tasks. We have the initial feature search stage that is parallel and fast, and then that is followed by the attentional phase, which involves binding features together to form conjunctions of features, and that's how object recognition is now said to work. The idea of a parallel search, we've defined it there. So we had the case where a target is defined by the presence of a feature that's different from the features of the distractors, and how that happens very quickly and does not is not impaired when we have lots of distractors, versus the conjunction searches were more serial in nature, so they do get slower the more distractors we are, but it's a self-terminating type of search. We contrasted that with the possibility of a serial exhaustive search. Didn't have a lot of detail on exactly where serial exhaustive searches can show up in cognitive studies. This is more on what's called a memory scanning task, which we're not talking about, at least not yet. Also on visual attention, we talked about visual crowding, how crowded stimuli in your visual periphery can affect your ability to search for and detect a target. Under theories of selective attention, we talked about the filter idea, right? That we're filtering out the background distractors, but one question becomes, does this filtering occur early in the perceptual process, early selection? That is, all of the distractors are filtered out before they would ever make it into working memory and other higher cognitive steps? Or is it late selection, that we just basically let everything in, and then only once we are at these more central cognitive steps like working memory do we then select which things are relevant to the task? So the way to study this are a variety of different studies that ask whether or not people can say anything at all about things going on in the background while they're engaged in a specific task. So the dichotic listening task was an example of that. You're shadowing one message in one ear, you're ignoring a message in the other ear, and then later we're going to ask you how much information you can say about the unattended stream. And the answer was generally not much, although there were a few general things people could say, though, so that suggests maybe a little bit leaks through, but not very much. The change blindness study, as I mentioned earlier, possibly another example of early selection, right? That a lot of information simply just never makes it in, and therefore when you're comparing these flickering images, you don't know what's different because you're not attending to the critical thing, and therefore it never makes it past your attentional filters. Unless, of course, you're an expert in something. So we talked about that study where police officers were doing a change blindness study on driving scenes, and they did a lot better than control subjects, suggesting that someone's expertise and knowledge base influences their approach to attentional filtering. Late selection gives us things like the cocktail party effect. So here, the idea is that if you're blocking out the background conversation, but someone says your name, you still hear that. So that, again, it kind of bleeds through the filters. That would suggest that maybe it's coming in and is only being selected for after you've processed it. Conjunction searches, again, could be an example of late selection because of the idea that all of the features get processed and then we have to bind them and recognize at a later stage of processing. And we also talked about all these various semantic priming studies. These were the ones that involved the tree, palm, wrist sequence of words. So go back to those notes and make sure you're comfortable with the details of how those experiments worked and how the findings are interpreted, especially in the case of some of the kind of convoluted explanations for what happens in the primed versus unprimed and congruent versus incongruent word lists there. We also talked about the idea of task load, right? Task difficulty and how much demand, and whether that's a perceptual demand or whether that's a cognitive demand. And then when we were talking about that, it then is useful to bring up the idea of the attentional resource theory. We ask what these resources are. but the idea is that maybe they get depleted. They provide some kind of fuel to different kinds of cognitive processes. This is a useful way to approach the sustained attention and vigilance research because we see people in these kinds of tasks decline in their performance over time, called the vigilance decrement. People will report that their mind is wandering and things like that, and they just are much more easily distracted from the task. So we associate that with a transition in the brain to what's called the default mode network, away from the task positive network. And we could suggest that the task positive network is one that is very demanding of limited attentional resources, and that over time, as these resources are depleted, we have to give it a chance. We have to give it a chance to recover and restore. And that means shifting into default mode activity so that the task positive network can recuperate. Although we did entertain a kind of a newer idea based on thermodynamics, that cognition is intensive to the extent that it uses a lot of metabolic resources and therefore it generates heat, and that temperature fluctuations in the brain could be indicators of mental workload and possibly even boundary conditions regarding fatigue. And thermoregulatory processes are the things that get involved that influence mind wandering. So, switching to the default mode network might be thermoregulatory. We also talked about things like increased blood flow that's going to, kind of cool off the brain, and yawning and things like that could all be thermoregulatory processes designed to restore cognition. Okay, so that's it. As I always say, coming up on these kinds of exams and classes, let me know if you have questions. Got my office hours that are listed in the syllabus, but obviously you can send me an inbox message in Canvas basically anytime. I'll try to respond as promptly as I can. And that's that.